There's a moment every avoidant never sees coming. The moment you stop chasing them. That silence, that calm absence of pursuit, hits them harder than any confession of love ever could. Because in that stillness, they realize something they can't explain. They've lost control. And that's where emotional addiction begins. Avoidantly attached individuals are driven by contradiction. They crave connection, but fear what it demands. They want to be loved, but only if love doesn't require them to surrender. Most of their relationships revolve around control, controlling distance, timing, emotional depth. It's their protection. They stay in charge of when things move closer and when they retreat. But every avoidant eventually meets someone who flips that dynamic entirely. Someone they can't manage, predict, or emotionally dominate. That's when everything starts to change. At first, they'll try to dismiss it. They'll tell themselves you're just another fleeting attachment. They'll pull away to prove they're still safe in their solitude. But something feels different. When you don't react the way others did, when you don't chase, when you don't plead, when you don't make their withdrawal your crisis, it disarms them. Their usual emotional defenses lose their power. Because avoidants are used to being the one who decides how close anyone gets. They measure relationships like they measure air, enough to breathe, never enough to drown. But then they meet someone who doesn't gasp for that air. Someone who stands still when they retreat, who doesn't try to bridge the silence, who simply allows space without fear. And suddenly, that space becomes unbearable. That's when the craving begins, quiet, invisible, but growing. They start wondering why your absence feels louder than your presence ever did. Why the silence they once cherished now feels like withdrawal. It's not your attention they miss. It's the loss of control. You've become an emotional mirror they can't escape, reflecting back everything they run from: vulnerability, desire, and the ache of connection. And once that mirror appears, it doesn't go away. It lingers. It haunts. It makes them think. Because emotional addiction for an avoidant doesn't begin with need, it begins with disruption. If you want to better understand how to deal with avoidance, then subscribe to the channel to know everything. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, control is everything. Not in the loud, domineering sense, but in the quiet, calculated way they manage closeness. It's how they stay safe. They decide when to text, when to disappear, when to open up, and when to retreat. Every action is a negotiation with their fear of being engulfed. They don't just control you. They control their own emotional exposure. That's how they survive intimacy without ever truly surrendering to it. But emotional addiction begins when that control starts to slip. At first, it's subtle. They tell themselves they're fine, that nothing's changed. But suddenly, they're checking their phone more than they'd like to admit. They're rereading old messages, scanning your social media, wondering why they're thinking about you at all. This confusion terrifies them because it's not supposed to happen. The avoidant was never meant to feel out of control. You see, emotional distance is their oxygen. It allows them to feel powerful, autonomous, safe. But when they meet someone who activates real emotion, someone grounded, self-contained, and unavailable to manipulation, they start to suffocate on their own silence. What once felt like peace now feels like emptiness. What once was power now feels like loss. That's when craving begins to grow beneath the surface. It doesn't look like affection. It looks like curiosity, irritation, even obsession. They start to wonder, why can't I stop thinking about them? That question alone destabilizes their emotional system. Because for the avoidant, thinking about someone this much means danger. It means attachment. The truth is, what they're addicted to isn't you. It's the emotional equilibrium you disrupt. You refuse to play the part they expect. You don't collapse into need when they pull away. You hold your peace. You stay whole. And that wholeness forces them to confront what they've avoided their entire life: the cost of isolation. They don't want to need anyone, but suddenly they feel the ache of missing someone who never begged to be needed. That paradox, wanting what they fear, craving what they reject, is the core of their emotional addiction. It's not about romance. It's about power slipping away. And the more they try to regain it, the deeper they fall. Avoidants are not drawn to chaos. They're drawn to mystery. Not the performative kind, not mind games or emotional manipulation, but the quiet, grounded mystery of someone who doesn't reveal everything all at once. Someone who feels complete on their own. That self-possession, that emotional stillness, is magnetic to the avoidant because it represents the one thing they can't easily decode or control. You see, avoidants are emotional analysts. They study people. They predict reactions. When they pull away, they know what comes next. The panic, the questions, the desperate attempts to reconnect. These responses reinforce their safety, confirming that they can retreat without losing the bond entirely. But when they meet someone who doesn't react, someone who holds space instead of chasing, who doesn't explain or justify, who simply remains composed, their framework collapses. This emotional mystery isn't a tactic. It's authenticity. You don't perform detachment. You embody self-respect. And that's what makes you unforgettable. Because to the avoidant, your calm is confusing. It doesn't fit their story of relationships being suffocating or dramatic. You've shown them that closeness doesn't have to mean chaos, and that realization terrifies them more than rejection ever could. In their mind, emotional independence equals disinterest, but your stillness doesn't feel like indifference. It feels like confidence. It feels like someone who chooses, not chases. And that subtle distinction creates a psychological shift. They start wondering what it would take to earn your attention, not because they want to play games, but because they feel the pull of someone who doesn't demand anything from them. This emotional curiosity grows quietly. They begin to observe you the way they once expected others to observe them. They notice the way you listen, how you don't fill every silence, how you seem at peace within yourself. To them, that composure feels like emotional fluency, a language they've never learned but suddenly need to understand. So they linger in thought. They replay moments. They analyze your words. They crave your energy not for validation, but for equilibrium. You represent something their nervous system both longs for and rejects: calm intimacy, connection without control, warmth without expectation. That's why your mystery isn't about hiding. It's about existing as someone who doesn't overextend to be seen. And for an avoidant, that quiet confidence is the most powerful drug there is. At first, the avoidant thinks they've won. You've stopped reaching out, stopped trying to close the distance. They feel that familiar sense of relief, the quiet space they equate with safety. But that peace doesn't last. Something begins to feel off. The silence that once comforted them now feels heavy, unfamiliar, almost wrong. And this is the moment the emotional withdrawal begins, not yours, but theirs. Avoidants are accustomed to being the ones who disappear. They're the ones who decide when connection ends and when it resumes. But when you pull back, when you no longer feed the dynamic, it reverses the emotional flow. Suddenly, they're the one waiting, checking, wondering. The absence they used to control now controls them. And that reversal is the first sign of emotional addiction taking root. They might not show it, of course. They'll act calm, maybe even colder than before. But internally, their mind starts to spiral. They replay your last message. They wonder if you noticed their withdrawal. They rationalize. Maybe they're just busy. But then the thoughts grow darker. Did they move on? Did I push too far? Did I lose them? These are questions an avoidant never wanted to face, because they break through the illusion of emotional independence. When someone like you steps back without anger or explanation, it creates a kind of emotional silence they can't interpret. You didn't explode. You didn't plead. You didn't perform heartbreak. You simply vanished with grace. That grace becomes unbearable, because for the avoidant, detachment has always been their language of power. But you've spoken it better. And now, they're feeling something foreign, longing. Real, raw, unfiltered longing. Not for attention or reassurance, but for the emotional steadiness you carried. The way you made them feel safe without demanding anything in return. The way your presence didn't need to prove itself. That memory starts looping in their mind, filling the space where control once lived. They'll start rationalizing their thoughts, trying to reframe the craving as curiosity. I just wonder how they're doing. I just miss the conversations. But the truth is simpler. They miss how they felt around you. Because around you, their avoidance didn't feel like a flaw. It felt understood. And that understanding, that rare sense of being accepted without being chased, becomes the hook they can't shake. The same space they once used to escape is now the same silence that pulls them back. Avoidants don't usually grieve people. They grieve control. When a connection ends, they often move on quickly, convincing themselves it never really mattered. They keep busy, distract themselves, dive into work, hobbies, or new faces. They tell themselves they're fine, that you were nice but not special. But that's just their armor talking. Because eventually, the distractions fade, and what's left behind isn't peace, it's recognition. The quiet, undeniable truth that you were different. This is the moment they start trying to replace you. It's not always conscious. They might date again, flirt, or re-engage old connections. But every attempt carries an invisible comparison. No one feels quite the same. The conversations feel lighter, emptier. The spark doesn't land. The emotional safety they once felt in your presence doesn't appear elsewhere. And that's when the craving intensifies. Because what you gave them wasn't intensity, it was calm. And calm doesn't echo easily. Avoidants are addicted not to drama, but to equilibrium that feels earned. With you, they never had to perform. You didn't chase them or demand emotional availability. You allowed space. You gave them something they rarely experience, freedom within connection. And that paradox is what makes you irreplaceable. Most of their relationships reinforce their avoidance. When they pull back, others chase. That chase confirms their fear that intimacy equals pressure. But you didn't chase. You let the silence stand. And that silence revealed something they weren't ready to face. How deeply they actually wanted to stay. So now, when they think of you, they feel the emotional dissonance of wanting closeness, but having lost the one person who didn't demand it. That contradiction becomes the center of their fixation. They may not text or call, but they check your stories, scroll through old photos, remember details they thought they'd forgotten. They're searching for the emotional steadiness you carried, but what they're really seeking is the reflection of themselves they found through you. The version of them that felt a little safer, a little softer, a little more capable of love. It's not that they can't find someone else. It's that they can't find that feeling again. The feeling of being seen without being pursued, cared for without being controlled. The very dynamic they thought they didn't need has become the one they can't live without. And that's when they realize, you weren't just an option. You were the calm they mistook for boredom, the peace they mistook for detachment, the depth they weren't ready to swim in. Avoidants never mean to obsess. They pride themselves on being detached, on keeping their emotions tidy and contained. But obsession doesn't come from passion for them. It comes from fear. Fear of losing something they didn't know they valued until it was gone. Fear of realizing they've misjudged the one person who saw through them without judgment. When an avoidant begins to obsess, it doesn't look like anxious pursuit. It's quieter, more private. They won't chase you. They'll think about you. Constantly. They'll replay old messages, look for hidden meanings in your last words, stalk your social media, but never like a post. They'll imagine how conversations might go if they reached out. They'll wonder if you've already replaced them, and that thought burns. Because it exposes the very thing they've denied all along. They cared. This kind of emotional fixation is terrifying for an avoidant. Their mind becomes a tug-of-war between two opposing instincts. One side wants to protect them, to withdraw, to forget, to stay safe in solitude. The other side aches to return to the one place they felt calm, seen, and oddly at peace. It's not love that pulls them back. It's the relief they once felt in your presence. the rare feeling that they didn't have to hide to be accepted. That emotional imprint becomes addictive. Every time they try to disconnect, their thoughts betray them. They wonder if you're still thinking of them, if you understood what their silence really meant. They may even rationalize it. I just missed the connection, not the person. But the truth is deeper. What they miss is how they felt when they were with you. The part of them that briefly surfaced. Open, curious, human. Avoidants don't become addicted to people. They become addicted to the version of themselves they only discovered in rare moments of safety. And when you leave, that version vanishes too. So they search for it again, in memories, in messages, in their own mind. And yet, they'll rarely reach out. The fear of being exposed is stronger than the desire to reconnect. Instead, they linger in silence, feeding their thoughts like an old flame they can't extinguish. The same fear that once made them pull away now keeps them trapped. Because the more they resist what they feel, the more they're consumed by it. That's how avoidance turns into obsession, when the act of staying detached becomes more painful than connection ever was. Avoidants live behind the quiet fortress of their ego. It's not arrogance, it's armor. The ego tells them they're fine alone, that needing someone is weakness, that emotions complicate everything. It builds a story. I'm in control. I choose detachment. But when they meet someone who sees through that armor, who doesn't chase, doesn't crumble, and yet still cares, that story begins to unravel. And when it does, the ego doesn't surrender gracefully. It fights. The first signs of that battle are confusion and defensiveness. They start to think of you in contradictions. I didn't even like them that much, followed by, why can't I stop thinking about them? The ego keeps trying to rewrite the narrative to preserve its power. But the heart knows the truth. Something about you touched them in ways they can't undo. The ego's purpose is to keep them safe, but safety for an avoidant has always meant distance. Now, closeness has made them feel more alive than avoidance ever did, and that realization shakes their foundation. They start oscillating between two poles, the impulse to reach out and the terror of being seen. Their messages stay unsent, their calls unmade, but their mind is flooded with what-ifs. This is where emotional addiction deepens. The ego wants control, but the craving for connection won't be silenced. They may even try to suppress it, date someone new, focus on work, retreat further into solitude. But suppression is not healing. The more they push away their feelings, the louder they become. Because the truth is, they don't miss your attention. They miss the reflection of who they were around you. The version of themselves that felt capable of softness. That memory becomes dangerous to the ego, because it threatens everything it's built. The ego thrives on the illusion that independence equals strength. But you showed them another kind of strength, emotional integrity, quiet confidence, boundaries without bitterness. You didn't need them, and yet you were fully present. That paradox disarms them. Because deep down, the avoidant doesn't actually want power. They want peace. And you made peace look possible. That's what makes the battle so painful. Their ego screams, forget them. But their soul whispers, you felt safe there. And between those two voices, they begin to fracture, pulled between who they pretend to be and who they could become if they just let themselves be seen. Avoidants don't like mirrors, emotional ones especially. They spend years building distance between what they feel and what they show. It's not dishonesty, it's protection. Vulnerability has always felt like standing in front of a mirror with no armor on, exposed, uncertain, raw. But when someone like you enters their life, someone who doesn't demand closeness but invites it, who doesn't fix them but sees them, that mirror appears. And once it's there, they can't look away forever. At first, they try. They suppress. They rationalize. They say, it's over. I've moved on. They fill their days with distractions, their nights with noise. But quiet moments betray them. A song, a memory, a random scent. It pulls them back, not just to you, but to themselves. Because every time they remember you, they're not just remembering you. They're remembering how they felt when they stopped hiding. Suppression can only last so long before it starts turning inward. What begins as avoidance slowly becomes reflection. Questions arise, ones they've never asked before. Why do I always pull away? Why do I feel safer alone? Why did someone's calm presence scare me more than their love? These questions hurt. They break through the emotional numbness the avoidant has spent a lifetime perfecting. But they also open the door to something new, awareness. You see, avoidance isn't just about running from others. It's about running from themselves, their pain, their longing, their belief that love and loss are the same thing. But when the memory of someone stable, grounded, and emotionally secure lingers, it challenges that narrative. You didn't chase them, you didn't punish them, and yet your presence lingered longer than anyone's demands ever did. That kind of emotional imprint forces them to see the truth. It wasn't your love that frightened them. It was their inability to receive it. And that realization is both humbling and haunting, because once they see it, they can't unsee it. The person they thought they could forget becomes the one who taught them what real connection actually feels like: safe, slow, and honest. In that mirror, they start to recognize the loneliness behind their independence, the ache behind their control, the longing behind their silence. And while they may not admit it out loud, that recognition becomes the beginning of something fragile but real: healing. Because what began as suppression, the desperate attempt not to feel, slowly becomes the first step towards self-understanding. And ironically, it's you, the person they tried to forget, who led them there. For most avoidants, emotion arrives late. It doesn't hit them in the moment. It comes after the silence, after the distance, after the illusion of indifference has worn thin. When they finally feel, it's like a quiet earthquake, invisible to the outside world, but inside, everything shifts. This awakening doesn't come with grand gestures or confessions. It starts small. They wake up one morning and realize they haven't stopped thinking about you. They remember the sound of your voice, not in words, but in tone: calm, steady, kind. They notice that the emptiness they once mistook for freedom now feels like loss. And for the first time, they can't distract their way out of it. It's disorienting, feeling something they've spent their life avoiding. Love, grief, regret, longing, it all comes rushing in at once. Their mind tries to fight it. You're fine. Move on. Don't be weak. But their body betrays them. They feel the heaviness in their chest, the tension they can't shake, the restlessness that has no name. This is what awakening feels like. The moment the emotional walls crack and the reality they've been running from finally gets in. They start to see you differently now, not as someone who triggered them, but as someone who revealed them. You didn't create their fear of intimacy, you illuminated it. You didn't make them avoidant, you made them aware. That distinction matters, because for the first time, they realized that the love they pushed away wasn't a threat, it was an invitation. And that realization hurts. It hurts because it's too late to undo the distance. It hurts because they can't unfeel what they've suppressed. And it hurts because, deep down, they know they might not get another chance with someone who met their walls with grace instead of resistance. But even through that pain, something shifts, something essential. The awareness that their patterns are not protection, but prison. That avoidance doesn't prevent heartbreak, it only guarantees loneliness. And in that awakening, they begin to see vulnerability not as exposure, but as connection. They won't admit it easily. They might still pretend to be fine. But somewhere deep inside, a door has opened. And once it's open, they can't close it again. That's the paradox of avoidance. They spend their lives running from feeling until the one person who made them feel safe enough to feel is gone. And in that loss, they finally meet themselves. Every avoidant reaches this moment, the quiet reckoning that comes long after you've gone. Not in the chaos of the breakup, not in the silence that followed, but in the stillness months later when their mind stops fighting the truth. That's when it hits them. What you were offering wasn't pressure. It was peace. What they were running from wasn't you. It was the feeling of being truly seen. Avoidants don't process love in real time. They process it in reflection, when the noise fades and the distractions lose meaning. Only then do they begin to understand what your presence actually represented. You didn't try to fix them. You didn't force them to open up. You didn't fill their silence with noise. You simply stayed honest, calm, and self-contained. You showed them a version of connection that didn't demand surrender, only authenticity. And they mistook that steadiness for indifference. Now, in the aftermath, they see it differently. Your boundaries were love. Your calm was safety. Your absence is the lesson. Because what they finally realize is that you never abandoned them. They abandoned the version of themselves that was capable of being loved by you. That understanding doesn't arrive with regret alone. It arrives with clarity. They start to notice the patterns they repeated with everyone else, the withdrawal, the testing, the emotional control, and see how hollow it feels now. Because none of it fills the space you left behind. None of it recreates the depth of being met by someone who didn't chase, didn't collapse, didn't make love transactional. You became the mirror that showed them their potential for intimacy. And that's why they can't forget you. Not because you were flawless or unattainable, but because you reached the part of them no one else could. The part that longed to be loved without being demanded, seen without being fixed, accepted without being feared. Now, when they think of you, it's not with defensiveness or denial. It's with something far more powerful, respect. They understand, finally, that what made them emotionally addicted to you was not your mystery, your beauty, or your distance. It was your wholeness. You didn't try to take from them. You stood beside them. You didn't ask them to be more. You showed them what being enough looked like. And that memory doesn't fade. It lingers as a quiet truth they carry forward, a reminder that love doesn't have to cost control, that intimacy doesn't mean loss, and that connection isn't something to survive, it's something to allow. So they move forward changed, perhaps still guarded, but no longer blind. Because you weren't a chapter they closed. You were the turning point they never saw coming. And if you've ever been that person, the one an avoidant can't forget, know this. You didn't lose them. You freed them. If this spoke to you, share it, subscribe, and let others find the words for what they felt but never said.